Good afternoon, everyone. We're still having a lot of people join, so we're just going to give it a minute or two here before we kick off. So thank you for your patience. All right. Good afternoon, everyone, or I guess good morning for those of you who are on the West Coast. Thank you for joining us today. This is going to be FTA's presentation on the overview of the preparation and submission of the Recipient Information Request, the RAR. We're assuming that most of you probably received that from your reviewing contractor pretty recently and may have some questions about how to go about preparing that, submitting a response that's going to make the reviewing contractor happy. So hopefully today we can share a little insight that makes the process a little bit easier for you. So just to start off, my name is Matthew Bussey, and I'm a senior associate at RLS & Associates, and I am joined here by my colleague, Greg Harnett, also a senior associate at RLS & Associates. Want to say hi, Greg?
Hi, everyone.
All right. So before we kick off too far, then I do want to just reiterate, oops, let me put this in presenter mode. Sorry about that. Bear with me 1 second. Right. I do want to reiterate that this is not your only bite at the apple. FTA is going to be presenting these RAR webinars over both today and also over January to try and give assistance as much as possible to recipients in their preparation of their RAR responses. Today, December 15th, is obviously where you're at right now. We're going to be focusing on recipients with annual operating expenses below 100 million. So typically what you think of as tier 4 recipients. Then in January, we're going to have 5 more webinars, the first of which on January 5th will be for recipients that have annual operating expenses above 100 million. So in other words, your tier 1s, your tier 2s, your tier 3s. Then on January 6th, we'll be doing a special webinar just for state DOTs. On January 11th, we'll be doing a webinar on RAR responses just on the civil rights topics. January 12th, we'll be doing non-civil rights topics. And then on January 13th, then if you missed this particular webinar, you have a colleague who would have liked to attend this webinar, then we'll be doing this exact same thing again. So you'll have multiple bites of the apple if you want to join, or if you have colleagues that missed today's presentation, definitely forward this to them. This presentation will be provided in the chat, as well as several other handouts that we'll go over momentarily. So Greg, do you want to take it away?
Great, yeah, I can pick it up here. Thank you, Matt. So a few things just to orient everyone to our webinar today. We're obviously using the Zoom platform. And as Matt just alluded to, very shortly, we're going to provide 4 documents in the chat that you should be able to download immediately once they're added. The first is the RIR template, which you probably already have. Next up is the FY22 Contractors Manual, hot off the presses. Then we're going to provide the slide deck for this current presentation that we're going through, and an office hours invite. I'll talk about that in just a second. So we're very fortunate to have a large group here. So happy you could all join. Because we have a large number of folks in the audience, we do want you to ask questions. We want to receive your questions, but to make it more manageable, we ask that you type your questions into the question box on the screen. And what we will do is, in the background as we're presenting, we're going to curate those questions. And at the end, we'll entertain any questions that you might have. Now, of course, you might perhaps be uncomfortable asking a question in such a large group. That's why we're going to have office hours. Actually, tomorrow, December 16th, from 1 to 3 p.m. Eastern, we're going to be having another Zoom meeting just like this, where we can entertain questions in kind of a live, real-time, back and forth way. So I'll be there. Matt will be there. We hope to see you there as well. And then the final bullet point on this slide, we are going to have some polls throughout this presentation, and we ask that when it is time to do a poll, please participate. We'll be able to see the results in real time. The poll will help us not only kind of tailor this current presentation, but as Matt went through, we're going to be doing this a number of times in front of slightly different audiences. So your feedback really does help us. So please participate in those polls. Let's move on.
Yep. And just to reiterate, the office hours, there's going to be that invitation in the chat box. And then also the very last slide of this presentation, which will also be in the chat box, has that link as well. So that's going to be from 1 to 3 p.m. tomorrow, Eastern time.
And look at this, our very first poll. So this question asks, how many triennial reviews have you previously participated in? Is this your first review? Perhaps you've been through 1 or 2, maybe 3 or 4, or maybe you're a real all-star veteran and you've been through 5 or more reviews. So please use the poll function to answer this. We'll give it just a few minutes so that a good number of results can trickle in, and then we'll share those results. Wonderful. So with about 77% of attendees answering, we can see that by far, most people are saying this is my first review, about 38%. And then actually it goes down in order. We have about 33% say they've been through 1 or 2 previous reviews, 16% between 3 and 4, and only 14% 5 or more reviews. So that's very good for us to know. Thank you. Great, so let's move on to the next slide. All right, we just want to talk a little bit about the purpose of this webinar. So as you probably know, today's webinar is an overview of the Recipient Information Request. A lot of people call that the RIR or the RIR. You might actually know it under a different name, perhaps. It used to be called the Grantee Information Request. So the GIR is now the RIR. And we'll talk about what the RIR is. A lot of our presentation today will be going through the review topics. There are 23 of them, and we'll describe exactly what those RIR documents you will need to upload are, and we'll give you some tips and best practices throughout. So of course, we are taking questions, but we want to point out that really starting right now, you can work with your reviewer, who you will probably know, they were identified in your RIR letter, and of course your FTA regional office. I assume you know which FTA region you sit in, but they will be available to help you starting right now, answer any questions you might have about the review process, or even specific questions that might be kind of just something you as an agency would like to ask directly. Great, so here's a real quick overview of our review process. As you can see here, where we are right now is RIR, Recipient Information Request. So the RIR is the step in our process in which you, the FTA recipient, is asked to provide information about your organization in advance of our virtual review. I think it's probably common knowledge now, we all know that your FY22 reviews will be conducted virtually. So if we look here at this process, we're at the RIR. This RIR will be due on or around, there are a few kind of variations, but it's January 21st, 2022 is when most of you will have your RIRs due. And then after that, what is going to happen is a scoping process where your reviewing contractor in the region will take a look at what you've provided and identify any review topics where an ERM or enhanced review module might be appropriate. And then after that, of course, you'll have your virtual site visit. Your reviewing contractor will conduct it virtually. It might look a lot like this over a video conferencing platform. And at the end of your virtual site visit, you will have an exit conference where the reviewing contractor will present a summary of any findings. And then after that summary, you'll receive a draft report. This is your opportunity as the recipient to kind of read over the report. If you feel anything has been mischaracterized, or perhaps a time frame associated with taking a corrective action isn't really tuned properly, this is your opportunity to kind of speak up and make sure that the finalized version of the report incorporates any input like that. Then, of course, once you receive the finalized version of the report, if you have any findings, that's the time where the clock will start ticking in terms of taking those corrective actions. So just a very quick overview of our review process. You can see we're at the RIR, not the beginning, but we're close to the beginning here. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about is Section A of the RIR. This is the first section that you'll have to fill out. So let's go on to the next one. So Section A is the recipient profile. It consists of 5 tables. Now, our audience here today is mostly Tier 4 agencies, so we probably don't have any states. So we'll kind of skip that content as we go through this presentation. Just in the interest of time, there's a lot of great stuff to get to. But the 5 tables are an operations profile. Again, we'll skip states. Sub-recipient facilities, I'll talk about why that's important. We also ask for award activity for both FTA and non-FTA funded projects. And then the final table is just contact information. So we'll have a slide for each one of those tables coming right up. So we'll talk about it in a little more detail, but let me just touch on the objectives of this recipient profile. So as you can see, it helps describe your agency. The last time a lot of you had a triennial review was back in FY 2018. A lot has happened since then, especially in the last 2 years. So because so much has changed, the recipient profile is kind of a snapshot of where your organization is currently. And it's really important to communicate that to your reviewer and the FTA region. It provides the reviewer with a clear picture of your organization's size, the modes of operation that you provide. And also, as you probably know, this triennial review process is kind of tailored to different organizations. So there might be aspects or review topics that are not applicable to your organization. As you fill out this recipient profile, that'll set your reviewer on the right path in terms of tailoring the review to your specific organization. And then you can see also on this slide, we have our first RIR tip. We ask that you complete the RIR, especially the recipient profile, as accurately as possible. If you are, for instance, unsure of how to respond to something, I would actually just kind of note that. Like, we think we have a sub-recipient, but it might be a contractor. I think identifying that early would be good, and that will help your reviewer kind of work in partnership with you to resolve those issues. And that will lead to a better outcome as opposed to maybe addressing that much later in the process when there may not be time to kind of fix things up in the background. Let's move on. Okay, so here's that table 1, the operations profile. We want to make sure that the information that you're providing here in the RIR is consistent with the other documents that you'll be uploading under the different review topics. So again, a lot has changed in the last few years. This operations profile should reflect your organization right now. And if that is inconsistent with any of the documents that you've uploaded, that's probably a good sign that this is perhaps the opportunity to update those older documents so they do reflect your current operations. We also ask that you list any sub-recipients and contractors that you've had at any point during our review period. And actually, I should say this now, this is a very special review coming up in FY22. We know it's called the Triennial Review, but for you guys, we could almost call it the Quadrennial Review, if that's a word. You're not going to see that word. It'll be referred to as a triennial. But again, because the last time you were reviewed was in FY18, and we're talking about these upcoming reviews in FY22, that's actually a 4-year review window, because the window really starts from the date of your last site visit in 2018 all the way up to including your 2022 virtual site visit. So we've got 4 years here. And we also ask that in this operations profile, you're including contractors or lessees that are locally funded, as well as, FTA funded contractors, sub-recipients, or lessees. And that is just so the reviewer can have a more holistic profile of your agency. Obviously, the triennial review in most cases sticks to just FTA funded programs, but just to kind of have that context, we also ask that you put some locally funded information in there if it is relevant. Great, let's continue on. Okay, so we're still on table 1. I do want to point out the span of service, which you can see right here. We're asking that you enter the information as it appears here. So the span of service should have start and stop times of operations. If you just kind of write the total number of hours of service under each mode, it's not as helpful. For instance, if you operate fixed route, 7 hours weekdays, that's not as helpful as actually putting the start and stop time. Additionally, you can see on kind of the bottom part of this image, the RIR will ask for you to identify all the transit facilities that your organization has. And we want to make sure we identify accurately those facilities that were constructed with FTA monies or renovated with FTA funding. So that's what that column that says FTA interest means. So if there was any FTA funding that contributed to that facility, you would write yes. And just kind of as a look forward to some of our topics we're going to go through, like maintenance, you can probably already anticipate where I'm going with that. If you have an FTA funded facility, then one of the things the RIR will ask you to upload is a written facility maintenance plan for any FTA funded facilities you have. Great, let's continue on. All right, now let's talk about table 3. Remember, we skipped table 2, that's only for states. Table 3 is asking about sub-recipient facilities. And I'm going to take this opportunity right now to kind of explain a theme that we'll touch on a few times throughout this presentation. If you are an FTA recipient who has sub-recipients, you essentially stand in the shoes of these sub-recipients in terms of their compliance. So this really triggers kind of an oversight responsibility for you as the recipient. So in many ways, this triennial review is extending not just to your organization, but any sub-recipients you might have. That's why we're asking for this similar facility information, specific though to your sub-recipient. So if you have multiple sub-recipients, obviously you would want to identify which one has the facility description. It could be a transit center, administrative offices, maybe a maintenance bay. The source of FTA funding, meaning perhaps it's section 5307, maybe section 5339. I think year completed is self-explanatory, and location, we really mean street address. Great, so moving on to the next table, award activity. So this really asks for 3 different things. The first is a brief description of any noteworthy projects that you've completed since your last triennial review. The second is a description of any noteworthy projects that are presently ongoing. And then finally, you can probably see where we're going. We'll ask for any noteworthy projects that your organization is planning to undertake within the next 3 to 5 years. So remember, you would want to include not just FTA funded, but also locally funded projects here, just so your reviewer has all of the context. And this is a great place to brag, frankly. So take credit for any completed projects that you're very proud of. I think this is important because, as you might know, if you've been through the triennial review process before, your compliance report is an exception-based report, meaning that we don't really get the opportunity as authors of those reports to say all of the nice things we observed over the course of the review. But you might recognize that a form of this table does appear in your compliance report. So this is really one of the inputs that flows into that. So this is a great time to take credit for completed projects, and that information could actually make it into the finalized version of your reports. Finally here, I want to say that, you know what? We're back. Well, here's another poll question. We'll just keep it moving. We've got a lot of great stuff to get to. So we're asking you, what is your primary topic of focus for this triennial review? So we have a few buckets of review topics here. The first is civil rights. That includes ADA, DBE, Disadvantaged Business Enterprise, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, an EEO, Equal Employment Opportunity. Or maybe it's procurement. That's probably what I would select. Or perhaps the maintenance bucket of topics. So that's maintenance, transit asset management, satisfactory, continuing control. Or maybe it's financial management and technical capacity. As you'll see, there are actually 3 kind of sub-chapters in technical capacity. We'll get to all of that. Perhaps it's legal, school bus, charter bus, drug-free workplace act, or drug and alcohol testing program. Or maybe it's the programmatic areas like section 5307, section 5310. Or perhaps you don't want to be defined or boxed in, you like them all, you would choose that final option, all of the above. So the poll's open now, we'll take a look at the results. Great. So I'm seeing some clear trends here. It looks like 51% of you answered all of the above. That's great. And then the next most popular was procurement, perhaps because I said that's how I would answer it. There's no right or wrong answer here. But this is very good for us to know. And frankly, all of the above is a good way to start your preparation.
That's the problem.
Great. So let's continue on. All right, great. I'll pass it back to you, Matt.
Okay, great. Thank you, Greg. So the next part of the RIR is the document upload section. And basically this goes through each of the 23 review areas, and each one of those review area sections in the RIR has a similar setup. First of all, it states the basic requirements. So here, just as an example, then we've got the financial section. It's stating the basic requirement for financial. Then the next thing in the document upload section is the document table, where it asks for a couple different things. First of all, it states the required document. So here in our example, financial statements or CAFRs. Then it asks for, or it states the applicability. And so obviously certain things aren't going to apply to everyone. If the required document is Sub-Recipient Oversight Procedures, for example, and you had no sub-recipients, then that's not going to be applicable to you. So the applicability section kind of delineates that. Then there's a date submitted box. And what I find this really useful for is if I'm going through a folder of documents that have been submitted to me by a recipient, and I'm trying to do a review of those, then if I don't come across something and I go back to the RIR and you say that you submitted it on X date, then I'll reach out to you and I'll be like, okay, you know, I didn't see this in our folder, but it says that you submitted it. Just looking to see if you could provide it again. And that way, you know, we're all on the same page. So it kind of illuminates that for you. Next up is the electronic file name, which is pretty self-explanatory. And then our last box here in the document table is comments from the recipient, which is really one of the most crucial boxes. It's an opportunity for you to provide any narrative explanation as to, you know, if maybe a document is being revised, so you're going to provide it later, or maybe a document isn't applicable. And so you can provide an explanation of why it's not applicable. So one of the key takeaways, if you take away anything from this this webinar today, is definitely use that comments from the recipient box as much as possible, because it's helpful to the reviewer. Lastly, in the document upload section, then this is true for some review areas, not all of them, but there are some open-ended questions. You guys may remember that in your previous, if you did the GIR, the GIR back in the day, then that really asked you to provide a lot of narrative responses, and it was lighter on the document upload aspect of things. The current way of doing it, as you can see, is more focused on document uploads, but there are still a few narrative questions the FTA would like you to answer so that it can give context to the reviewer prior to the review. So when you're submitting documents, and don't worry, this table as well as instructions are included in the beginning of your RIR that you received, then there is a folder naming convention that we'd ask you to follow. As you know, there's a lot of documents that you'll be submitting, and so it's really helpful if you can identify the documents in this format, really being exact as far as what they are responding to. So that way, when the reviewer is looking for your local match amounts and sources, then they go right to 2B1 and they've got your state match, your city match, et cetera, and they can align that requirement with what you submitted. That makes it goes a long way. The next thing is for the most part, nobody's dealing with snail mail anymore. So reviewers collect the information from your RIR response, typically through a file transfer protocol site, an FTP site, think like Dropbox or something similar to that. And one thing that you should do very early on in the process is to work with your reviewer and figure out what their file sharing protocols are. They'll probably send you instructions on how you're supposed to upload documents. And so figure those out early on. And what you definitely want to do is check your credentials right now. The last thing you want to do is, on January 21st at 11:59 p.m. if that's the deadline for submitting your RIR response, to log in for the first time and figure out your credentials don't work. So it's best to figure that type of stuff out now. So there are actually 23 areas that are being reviewed this go round, and I'm not going to go over all of them here, but I just wanted to point out a couple new ones that have been added since 2018. The new ones are Transit Asset Management, Public Transportation Agency Safety Plan, PTASP, and also cybersecurity. So 23 different areas that are being reviewed. And we'll go ahead and start with the legal section, the first section. The first item that's requested in legal is a list of litigations, breaches, defaults, disputes, or instances where the federal government was named as a party to litigation or legal disagreement since the last review. And a couple things to note here. First of all, we're talking about transit-related litigation, breaches, disputes. So if you're a city and you have a litigation or dispute in some other department that has nothing to do with transit, then just ignore that. We're only focusing on transit aspects. It's also helpful for you to coordinate the list that you're going to provide to your reviewer with your legal counsel. That's going to be important because not only you're providing a list, but once you provide that list, then your reviewer is going to want to follow up and see, okay, if there was litigation, did you notify FTA's chief counsel or FTA's regional counsel, et cetera? Who's going to have that email or that communication with FTA? It's going to be your legal counsel most likely. So coordinate the list development with them. Then in addition in legal, then we're looking for a list of false claims under the False Claims Act, as well as any instances of fraud, waste, or abuse. Again, these are things that need to be reported to the FTA Chief Counsel or FTA Regional Counsel. So again, work with your legal counsel to make sure that everybody's on the same page as far as whether you have any of those, and provide an accurate list to your reviewer. Then in addition to that, if you have any lobbying that you've performed where you spent non-federal funds for lobbying for transit purposes, obviously you can't lobby for transit purposes with federal funds, that's not allowed. But if you do it with state funds, you are allowed to do it, but you have to file a quarterly OMB LLL form. And so if you've done any state-funded lobbying, then provide those LLL forms. In addition, if you have any sub-recipients or contractors or anything like that, and they've done any type of lobbying, then also include those in your submission to your reviewer. So throughout this document, or throughout this webinar, rather, excuse me, we're going to try and share a couple of RIR tips that we just think will go a long way. The first is that for files used to satisfy multiple requested documents, please indicate where in the file the information can be found. So if you have a 200-page procurement manual that you're submitting and we're looking for information on liquidated damages and whether you use them or not, if you can just say, hey, it's on page 82, that goes a long way. In addition, if there is no document that you're uploading, say you don't have a written procedure for formulating NPRs and FFRs, you just have a practice for it, but it's not written anywhere. And so as a result, you don't actually upload anything. Please indicate why in that comment box that we mentioned before. That's your opportunity to explain anything. And when you don't upload something, then that's an immediate follow-up item for your reviewer. Providing that explanation puts a button on that. And so here's just an example, going back to our legal section, of a well filled out comment box. So we've got that request A for the list of litigations, et cetera. Here, XYZ Transit has done a fantastic job of stating in the electronic file name NA because they haven't uploaded anything. And in the comments, and they say XYZ Transit has not had any litigations, breaches, et cetera. And so as a result, the reviewer knows this isn't something they just skipped over or missed, or there wasn't an oversight. I actually know that this is the case. Now, obviously, when the reviewer is doing the review, they're going to follow up and make sure that when they're conducting the review, nothing's things change between when you submit the RIR and the actual review. That could be 6-9 months, who knows? And so they'll follow up then. But at the very least, this gives them that indication as of when you submit the RIR response. Greg, financial
Thanks, Matt. So
management.
I'll pick it up here with our second topic, financial management and capacity. I'll tell you right now that this is one of the heavier lifts in terms of what the RIR is asking you to provide. So I just wanted to get that out of the way now. But as soon as we run through the material in financial management and capacity, we'll give you another one of those RIR tip slides, and hopefully that will put everything in context, and I'm hoping make you feel a little bit better about everything we're asking here. So let's start with item A. The RIR is asking for financial statements or comprehensive annual financial reports for the past 3 years. Of course, we know, even though it says 3 years for the FY22 reviews, it's the past 4 years. We have kind of that quadrennial review. So sometimes the comprehensive annual financial reports, a lot of people call those CAFRs under that acronym. Depending on the auditor who wrote these reports, they have wildly different formats, and we often see these reports kind of separated out into 2 reports, and there's a compliance supplement that actually is probably what your reviewer would be more interested in seeing. So if you do have a compliance supplement to your CAFRs, make sure that's what you're providing. Continuing on, item B, if you are a larger recipient, you happen to have an internal audit department, what the RIR asks you to provide are internal audits for the past, well, we'll just say review period. If that's applicable, that would be good information for your reviewer to see. Moving on to item C, the RIR asks for a list of funds that's used to support transit programs for your review window and looking ahead also 3 years. And this list of funds should have the source, the amount, the status of that funding source, and any potential changes that might affect that funding source. For instance, if you are benefiting from a tax, but that tax sunsets at a certain point, that's something you would want to communicate along with item C in your RIR. Item D asks for financial management policies and procedures. Now, I'm going to actually draw specific attention to this one. I can tell you just anecdotally and based on what my colleagues have experienced, this is a very common potential finding. So please listen closely when we're talking about D. There are 2 things that you absolutely must have in writing in your financial management policies and procedures. The first is you have to have something that addresses how your organization determines the allowability of costs. And the second is you need to have some discussion about the timely distribution of funds. What we're really talking about is echo disbursements there. So you can see in our guidance column that we point to 2 CFR 200. That's OMB's uniform guidance. A lot of us call it super circular. That's not the formal name, but I think it's probably the cool way to talk about it. So the super circular will give you more information about the factors affecting the allowability of costs. And then when we're talking about disbursements within 3 business days, really what that means is if you're a recipient who's not operating on a reimbursement basis and you're drawing down ECHO funds in advance of your disbursement of them, you can see here that that disbursement has to be within 3 business days. So all of this needs to be specifically addressed in writing.
And Greg, if I could interject on that. So even if you are working on a purely reimbursement basis, that doesn't mean that you can't have this as a written policy. If you don't have this as a written policy, then it's most likely going to be a finding. So you basically have to have a policy that states we work on an exclusively reimbursement basis, but if for whatever reason we ever drew down in advance, then we would disperse those funds within 3 business days.
Absolutely. Great. So continuing on, we won't talk much about E. This is for states only. You may have heard of the Cash Management Improvement Act of 1990. It's basically the framework for transferring monies from the federal government to the states. We won't spend much time on that. We'll go to item F. The RIR asks for an organization chart for your organization as a whole that shows where either the financial office or the finance function lives within your organization. So as you can see, it will be a current organizational chart. And if possible, if you could include job titles and names in that chart, that would benefit your reviewer. Items G and H are similar, so I'll kind of talk about them together. G asks for position and job descriptions for key financial staff who manage FTA funds. So you would want to upload just kind of the generic job descriptions for those individuals. And then building on that is item H here, where the RIR asks for the actual resumes of those individuals who inhabit those roles. So resumes for the same positions that are noted under item G. Let's continue on. Great, so item I, actually everything on this slide is kind of related. So basically I, J, and K are asking for sample records from your financial system, and there are specific things that have to be in there. So looking at I, we can see that you would want to provide a sample record from your financial system that shows your FTA awards, including the award title and number, the FAIN, that's the Federal Award Information Number and year. That's basically your grant number. Also the name of the awarding federal agency. If you have any pass-through entities, you would want to highlight that. And then we'll just flip on to J here. Also, you would want to provide sample financial records indicating federal awards, including the amount awarded, what's been authorized, encumbered, expended, and identify any income earned. And you can see again, for each one of these, we have a citation to 2 CFR 200. We'll call it the super circular, but it's OMB's uniform guidance. So looking then at the final item on this slide, K, the RIR also asks for the most recent variant report or reports that show the budget and then the actual expenditures as a comparison for completed FTA awards. And again, we'll keep moving then. So I told you this was a longer section. We're continuing on. We're going to use almost the whole alphabet here. Item L, the RIR will ask for sample worksheets that you use to calculate operating expenses. I also want to highlight this item specifically. As you might know, in the context of the pandemic with the CARES Act and other sources of emergency relief funding, FTA has a lot of recipients who previously may not have requested operating assistance who are actually benefiting from that now. So this is an increased area of focus for these FY22 reviews. If you haven't previously received operating assistance, but you're using CARES Act funding for that, another important thing to note would be the federal percentage. As you probably know, for CARES Act, everything is 100% federal, whereas typically the operation split is 50% federal, 50% local. So keep an eye on the source of funding, what the federal percentage is, and also in calculating your operating expenses, you of course want to eliminate any ineligible costs. You would also want to deduct any fare box recovery that you've gained there. So if you actually look at FTA Circular 9030.1E, specifically Appendix C2, there's a nice operating expense worksheet there. So if you are not aware of that guidance, that's a nice place to look. Let's continue on to M. The RIR asks for a financial plan projecting revenues and expenses for the next 3 years. So as you can see, this can take the form of a short-range financial plan or perhaps a longer range plan that contains that same content. That would also be acceptable. But as Matt mentioned, if these are large documents that are many pages you're uploading, please be sure to identify specifically which page the relevant content appears on. Item N, the RIR asks for operating and capital budgets for the past, well, we'll say review period, we know it's 4 years, with comparison to the actual results. And as you can see, this typically takes the form of a year-end report that your financial software should be able to generate. All right, we're continuing on. Item O, we're still in financial management and capacity. The RIR asks for a listing of local or state legislation with sunset provisions that might impact your transit funding. We kind of already hit on this. The goal here is to identify any funding sources that are at risk and could impact your service going forward. Item Q is the annual budget to actual reconciliation reports for your entire transit program over the entire 4-year review period. And then item R, a list of sub-recipients that might charge indirect costs to you as the recipient. Of course, this would be not applicable if your organization does not have any sub-recipients. Okay, so that was a lot of stuff. Here are some tips that will hopefully make you feel a little bit better about all this. So if this RIR seems like a tall ask, it kind of is, but it's an excellent review preparation tool. So as you're gearing up for your triennial review, gathering your RIR submission will really help you focus in on what your reviewers will be looking for, the questions they might ask. In fact, I would suggest alongside your RIR using the FY22 Contractors Manual, which will actually show you the questions that the reviewers might ask. But in addition to those questions, if you're familiar with this document, which is now 650 pages, so it's quite a thrilling read. The Contractors Manual has indicators of compliance underneath each question, which is basically the question broken out into specific sub-questions or individual topics that could potentially lead to a compliance finding. So if you're preparing your RIR, you might want to have that Contractors Manual open right beside it so you could do that crosswalk and see, okay, this is what the RIR is requesting. Here's the corresponding question, and then you'll have all of the context there. So your triennial review is essentially an open book test, and the textbook for this course will be the Contractors Manual. Great, so back to you, Matt.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. So now we'll talk about technical capacity, which, as we mentioned earlier, is actually broken into 3 different sections. There's technical capacity award management, there's technical capacity program management, and there's technical capacity project management. So let's go through each of those and kind of look at what they're requesting. In award management, then the first thing that they're asking for in the RIR is award management reporting procedures, if they're not included already in your financial procedures that you submitted. These could be things like your policies and procedures on completing FFRs and MPRs. So who's responsible for completing the FFRs? Who's responsible for those are federal financial reports, and who's responsible for doing your MPRs, your milestone progress reports? Is there any coordination between those two people? How do they make sure that they're submitted on a timely basis? So if you have policies and procedures relating to those, then definitely your reviewer would like to see them. In addition, policies and procedures relating to developing echo draws. So again, who's responsible? Who is going to make the request for the echo draw? Who's going to approve it? Who's going to actually do the draw? Are we making sure that the draw isn't actually performed unless it was previously approved by the approving official? So again, having anything that documents your process for that will give peace of mind to your reviewer. And really what will happen is when the reviewer is doing the review, they already know what your process is. So it's just verifying that what you've put in paper is actually being implemented in practice. The last example here is policies and procedures relating to submitting and managing your single audits. If you're an agency or a recipient that expends $750,000 or more in any given federal fiscal year, then you have to submit single audits, and there are timeliness requirements for those types of things. So again, if you have policies and procedures about how you manage that whole process and manage to get those submitted timely, then provide those to the reviewer. The next thing that the reviewer will want to see that's requested in the RIR is a closeout schedule for all of your open awards. And so your reviewer, as part of doing their desk review, their pre-review, they're going to go into TRAMs and they're going to look at your open awards, and certain things are going to pose potential red flags, and those are going to be, your older grants, ones that are 3 years old and haven't had a disbursement recently. Sorry, I can't talk. Or simply ones that have been fully expended or almost fully expended. So those are things that are going to catch the attention of your reviewer. And they're also going to be looking to see if you actually follow your closeout schedule. If it says that, between now and the review happening is this particular grant that has very low amount of funding left in it, you're planning on, closing that out in June, the review is in July. Does that actually happen in June prior to the review? These are things that your reviewer is going to be double checking on when they speak with you. Next up for technical capacity is your program management and sub-recipient oversight. I'm going to skip these first 3 items because they're only for states, so we can kind of ignore those. Item D applies to states and also some recipients. If you're a designated recipient with Section 5310 or Section 5339 sub-recipients, then you have to develop a program management plan, and that's something your reviewer is going to want to take a look at. For item E, the standard sub-recipient application and award document for each program. So again, this is anybody with sub-recipients. You would want to provide those applications, awards, the sub-recipient agreements that you have with those sub-recipients. Those are things that your reviewer will want to take a look at as well. Under item F, then provide a list of all the subrecipients that you've had within the review period. As Greg keeps saying, it's not 3 years, it's 4 years. And what's important here is, first of all, you want to list the subrecipients by program. So if it's a 5310 subrecipient or 5339, whatever, indicate which funding source it is, but then also be cognizant of the fact that it's any subrecipient that you had during the review period. So say you had a subrecipient in 2019 and you didn't have them for 2020, 2021, you'd still want to include them on this list because the reviewer is going to want to look, hey, did they perform proper oversight of that subrecipient for 2019 when they were in fact a subrecipient? So include all the subrecipients that you've had over the review period, and your reviewer can follow up from there. In addition, for item G here, subrecipient oversight schedules for the past 3 and next 3 years. Basically, what they're looking for is, okay, are you visiting your subrecipients annually or quarterly, or what's your process? When did you visit them over the last 3 years, and when are you going to be visiting them over the next 3 years? Are we doing, collection of Title VI and EEO and whatever other types of documents on a periodic basis? Try and illustrate all of that to your reviewer. And again, one thing that may come into play here is you could be like, okay, in 2019, then yes, we did a visit to our subrecipients and we did all this stuff, but then COVID hit. So 2020 and 2021, we still did oversight, but we weren't able to do our physical meetings with them, our physical site visits. So here's what we did instead. All that is going to be invaluable for your reviewer to kind of get context about your whole processes. Lastly, here for item H, oversight procedures, anything that you have that you can provide to the reviewer to show how you conduct oversight of your subrecipients. If you, when you do your oversight, if you do site visits and you do a report afterwards noting any issues of non-compliance, and you assign corrective actions to the subrecipient, and you follow up with them to make sure they resolve that type of thing, and you have a document that reflects that whole process, definitely provide that, because that's going to show your reviewer that you are conducting proper oversight. If you don't have anything completed, then at the very least, provide oversight checklists, monitoring materials, any training materials or manuals that you give to the subrecipients to train them so that they can be compliant. All of those are things that your reviewer is going to find helpful. So please provide those. Then for our last section in technical capacity, which is project management, first thing we're looking for is the list of FTA funded capital projects undertaken during the review period. And for these, you want to include both the type of the project, but also the project cost, because that impacts what the reviewer is going to look at. When we see here in item B, project management plans, if written, project management plans aren't required for all projects. They are absolutely required. Formal project management plans are absolutely required for major capital projects. In other words, 100 million or up. If it's below 100 million, then you just have to have mechanisms for technical oversight of the project. So if you have formal project management plans, provide those. If you have something less than that for non-major capital projects, then either provide what you use if you have anything that's written, or explain your process to the extent that you can. So again, your reviewer has that going into the review, and it's not just an open item. They may have some follow-up nonetheless, but at least they'll have an inkling of what your process is. Item C for quality control procedures. If you have any documentation about how you ensure performance adherence to project requirements, you make sure that you're not incurring costs prior to getting the appropriate permits and, all those types of things, how you stay on track, how you stay on schedule and on budget. If you have any of those types of documents, then provide those as well. Item D is you'll want to identify any FTA funded capital projects with significant delays or cost increases. And note that this is not just construction projects. This includes all types of capital projects. And you'll see in item E that this is applicable not just for you, but also for your subrecipients. So if you have subrecipients who have projects that, again, have significant delays or cost increases, you want to provide those too, as well as hopefully evidence of that oversight where you're monitoring their significant delays and cost increases, and doing your best to assist them to stay on track. Item F, procedures for administering and monitoring construction projects, bus procurements, and other capital projects if written. So any written contract administration procedures, similar documents, provide those to your reviewer. Item G, a list of FTA funded projects for which the recipient and or subrecipients used force account labor. Force account labor is when you use your own workforce to perform work on a project. And depending on the amount, not everybody uses force account labor, but if you do, or if you have a subrecipient who does, then certain potential requirements apply depending on the threshold. If it's a force account that's $1 million or more, then you have to submit a force account plan to FTA. If it's $10 million or more, you actually have to not only submit to FTA, but get it approved by FTA before you can start incurring costs. So provide that list of FTA funded projects, both for yourself and also for any subrecipients if you or they use force account labor, and then it'll clue in your reviewer that they need to follow up. So they'll find that helpful. Item H, list of transit service contractors and lessees. Item I, standard transit management or service operator contracts or lease agreements. And item J, oversight procedures, including sample oversight checklists, monitoring materials, etc., for transit management or service contractors or lessees. Basically, if you have service contractors, you have management contractors, you have lessees, then your reviewer is going to be very curious how you're monitoring that, how you're overseeing them. And so anything you can provide to, again, illustrate that you're conducting that oversight is going to be beneficial for you and make it easier for your reviewer to understand what your process is. So we have a couple more RAR tips here. First of all, I think we've said this one maybe before, but we'll beat a dead horse. If you upload a document, please indicate where in the document the relevant piece of information can be found. If it's possible, upload searchable documents. And I'll just mention one thing here. Sometimes we'll see, what looks like a document that was printed on or typed on a typewriter that got scanned into your folders. And it's kind of a clue, if it's not searchable, that this is an older document. And that can be a red flag, for instance, if say it's a drug and alcohol policy. And we know that, well, there have been a lot of regulatory updates over the last 10 years in drug and alcohol. Similarly, DBE in 2012, you had to add a small business element. So if it's an old document and it's not something that's searchable, that's almost kind of an indication to the reviewer that they might want to take a pretty close look at it. So just a pro tip there. And then if you don't have a written policy or procedure to attach, again, explain what the policy or procedure is in practice. That's crucial. And if a requested document does not apply, it's NA or it's in process, whatever, or you just don't have it, then explain why. Greg, you want to talk transit asset management?
Great, thanks, Matt. And this is an exciting one. If your last triennial review was in 2018, then this topic was not covered during that review. So this might be the first time you're seeing this. So transit asset management, TAM. As we can see, the first item the RIR asks for is your TAM plan. I think this would be a good time to kind of talk about the two flavors of TAM plan. So FTA divides its recipients into Tier 1 and Tier 2 recipients for the purpose of the TAM plan. A Tier 1 recipient is essentially any recipient that operates more than 100 vehicles in peak service. If you're a Tier 1 recipient, then you're responsible for developing your own TAM plan. A Tier 2 recipient are those recipients who operate fewer than 100 vehicles in peak service. There are a few other characteristics of Tier 2 recipients, but we'll just keep it high level for right now. So as I run through these requested documents, I'll draw the distinction between Tier 1, Tier 2, and we'll talk about individual and group plans. So obviously the first item is your TAM plan. Moving on to item B, the NTD, National Transit Database Target Report. So this is an annual NTD report that you're probably familiar with. It'll identify rolling stock, equipment, facilities, and just for rail systems, also infrastructure. Item C is kind of related to this. So we would want to see documentation of the performance measures and targets set annually in your annual NTD report. So for vehicles and equipment, this will be expressed as a percentage of ULB, useful life benchmark. For facilities, it's going to use something slightly different. Maybe you've heard of the term scale. This is kind of an adjectival rating of the condition of a facility. There are 5 different rankings that range from excellent all the way down to poor. And then, of course, if you're a rail system, then you would want to express the percent of track segments with performance restrictions. Going down to item D, the RIR asked for the position and job description of the accountable executive. So each TAM plan has to have a specifically identified individual known as the accountable executive, and that person has the responsibility for the development and the execution of the TAM plan. Next slide. Thank you. Item E. The RIR asked for evidence that the TAM plan was shared with the state and or the MPO that provides funding. So this is something that you could answer by uploading some email or other correspondence that basically shows you've shared this TAM plan, again, with the state and or the MPO. Item F asked for any supporting records or documentations in your TAM plan. That would include performance targets, investment strategies and plans, or that annual condition assessment report. Now, most of the time, those are elements within the TAM plan, but if yours is formatted slightly differently, you want to make sure that all of the supporting records and documentation is provided with your RIR response. Okay, moving on to item G. Now, from this point until kind of the end of the TAM chapter, we're going to be talking specifically about those group TAM plans. So if you're a group TAM plan sponsor, meaning maybe you have sub-recipients that are tier 2 sub-recipients, they've decided to join your TAM plan because they don't have to prepare their own. If you're a sponsor of a group TAM plan, you would also want to provide then documentation that this was a coordinated development process with all the TAM plan participants, and also, of course, documentation that the finalized TAM plan was made available to all the sub-recipients. Moving on to item H, again, group TAM plan sponsors would provide notification from each of the participants in the group TAM plan that basically shows that the accountable executive from your participants, so each sub-recipient that you have, they also have to have their own accountable executive. So again, item H can take the form of like correspondence, a copy of email documentations, or really anything else that shows that as a group TAM plan sponsor, you've actually notified each plan participant. We'll continue to the next slide. Great. Item I. So again, for group TAM plan sponsors, the RIR is asking for a list of sub-recipients who perhaps have opted out of participating in your TAM plan. Maybe they've preferred to write their own, but you would want to make sure that you have some kind of correspondence or other documentation that shows that your sub-recipient has decided to opt out of the group TAM plan. Item J, the RIR is asking for documentation. This is again for group TAM plan sponsors that show that the finalized TAM plan was made available to all the participants who are included and help the development of that TAM plan. And of course, the TAM plan has to be in easily accessible format. So again, some kind of email correspondence would be strong evidence of this. Moving on to item K, the RIR asks for evidence that if you do have a group TAM plan, there should be a specific page in there that identifies explicitly those TAM plan participants who are part of your group TAM plan. So this might not be a separate document, but you would want to identify that page where that language will show. Moving on to item L, you would also want to make sure that you have the position and job description for the accountable executive. Again, this is for all of the participants in your group plan. Great. And then finally, under TAM, we have item M. So if you are a recipient who has either a tier 1 subrecipient or perhaps a tier 2 subrecipient who opted out of joining your group plan, maybe they've chosen to have their own plan, you would then want to provide some kind of evidence that you're exercising oversight of these subrecipients. That could take the form of perhaps checklists, a site visit questionnaire, maybe even a compliance report. You would just want to show that you're exercising your oversight responsibility of your subrecipients. Great. So let's move on to the next chapter, 7, Satisfactory Continuing Control. The first thing the RIR asks for is, if you do have this in writing, if you have property management procedures, then you would want to include that in your RIR submission. Moving on to item B, the RIR is asking for a listing of FTA-funded real property. And as you can see, this would be an inventory with certain required elements that are identified in 2 CFR 200. Also, they're very clearly listed in the Contractors Manual, so please take a look at that. But In general, this FTA real property listing is going to include land, any improvements or structures on that land, and appurtenances, which is just kind of a fancy way of saying anything that is affixed to a structure. The listing of FTA funded real property is also going to identify any property that has an incidental use. Also, if you have any property that's operated or managed by a contractor or a lessee, you would identify that. Anything that is owned or managed by a sub-recipient or was constructed or renovated since your last review. Also, we can see if you've had any facilities that have been idle for more than 1 year, that would also be identified on your real property listing. Moving on to item C, the RIR, if you are in this position, is asking for an excess FTA funded real property plan. So if you have excess FTA funded real property, you have to identify the reason why you have this excess property. And then with kind of a look towards the future, you should also kind of describe your plan for either fully utilizing this facility, or perhaps maybe the best alternative is to dispose of the facility. So this would all be wrapped up in your excess FTA real property plan. Item D, the RIR is asking for any sample real property incidental use agreements. So there are certain required elements that your reviewer would check for. Let's continue to the next slide. Great. Item E, the RIR is asking for a list of FTA funded facilities that you plan on constructing or renovating. So this would include the projected or perhaps actual start date if you've reached that point, the projected and actual completion date, and of course the FTA portion of the total project cost. In item F, actually, so F, G, and H, this is another area that I want to give some specific attention to. I think this is an area that FTA has become very focused on. It's not a new requirement, but I'll talk about F, G, and H kind of together. So we've been witnessing extreme weather really from coast to coast. I don't think that's news to anyone. So what this RIR is asking for under F, G, and H is if you have any federally funded facilities that are located in a FEMA flood hazard zone. And what that means specifically is a 100-year flood zone. And if you're not sure how you make that determination, well, actually on FEMA's website, you can enter the street address for any facility. It takes a while to load, but it should display a map with a few overlays, and that'll tell you if that facility, visually, it'll show you if it's located in one of these special flood hazard zone, a 100-year flood zone. So if you do have any facilities that kind of fall into that category, what FTA is asking is that, well, you have sufficient insurance coverage that covers the federal interest in that building. So this would be flood insurance. And as you can see, items G and H kind of expand on this. Really what G is asking for is basically, do you have procedures that describe what I just described to you? Do you have some kind of syndicated way in your organization of keeping track of which facilities might be located in one of these flood hazard zones? And then, of course, if you do, the requirement is that you carry flood insurance. So under H, we would want to see maybe your certificate of insurance or other policy documentation showing that you are currently maintaining that required flood insurance. Great, continuing on. Item J is asking for equipment management procedures. This doesn't apply to states. I know that we probably don't have many here in the audience today, but item I is asking specifically for any inventory control procedures, any processes that you have in place for loss prevention, your insurance requirements, and any disposition procedures. Moving on to item J, the RIR asks for documentation of your last physical inventory. As you may know, you're required every 2 years, so that's a biannual basis, to conduct a inventory of all your FTA funded assets and equipment and a reconciliation. So in other words, you want to make sure that all of your vehicles are where you think they are. You want to make sure the VIN numbers line up. And if there's any discrepancy as you're conducting this inventory, then that's when the reconciliation bit comes into play. So if you thought you had more or fewer vehicles than you did, the reconciliation would alert you that you need to actually take a closer look and make sure that you're maintaining and you're aware of which FTA funded assets you have.
I think, Greg, it's worth emphasizing, you said it, but just worth emphasizing, not just vehicles, not just your federally funded vehicles, but your federally funded equipment as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. So if you have any item of capital equipment, usually that's defined as costing more than $5,000. A good example might be a vehicle lift. that would also have to be, as Matt just described, in this kind of physical inventory. So not just vehicles, any FTA funded equipment assets. Great. So moving on to item K, the RIR is asking for a list of vehicles, and this list of vehicles should identify the status of the vehicle. I should clarify that this is just for FTA recipients who operate urban bus service. So you would want to identify all of your buses and say what the status is. Are they active? Do you have a contingency fleet? We'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. Perhaps you have some vehicles that are awaiting disposition. You would identify that. We would also identify which vehicles are funded by FTA. Perhaps you have other vehicles that are locally funded. We would want to draw that distinction in the listing of vehicles. And then, of course, if you have any vehicles that are directly operated or perhaps leased by a contractor or sub-recipient, we would identify that. We would also want to note who is maintaining these vehicles. Is your organization doing it in-house, or are you using some kind of third party to perform the maintenance of these vehicles? Finally, we can see that warranty information. So if you have vehicles covered under warranty, you would want to identify that. Really, the spirit of that requirement is if you have some work that can be covered under warranty, you should pay for it that way instead of drawing down from your FTA grant to fund that. And then finally, you would want to note any incidental use of these vehicles. Now you can see we say that a tabular presentation, meaning kind of like an Excel spreadsheet, is the best way to communicate this information to your reviewer. I think that's absolutely the case, but it's not required. So you don't need to have one specific spreadsheet where all of this information lives. We just note that as a best practice, and that'll probably ease the communication between your organization and the reviewer. Just give them that one sheet. Perfect. So moving on, we're looking at item L. The RIR is asking for any FTA funded equipment that you've disposed of over our review period. So if you've been involved in this process, you know there are a few key pieces of information. One is, has the asset reached the end of its useful life? If it has, it's a little easier. You can kind of dispose of that asset in accordance to the FTA requirements. And if it brings in a per unit value of less than $5,000, that essentially is your money. However, if it's more than $5,000, that's when FTA draws the line, and they typically ask to be reimbursed for their original percentage of participation in purchasing that vehicle. Now, of course, if you are in the unfortunate position where you have to dispose of a vehicle before it's reached the end of its useful life, there are just maybe more potential situations where you may owe FTA some of its interest back. Again, a tabular presentation is the best way to communicate this to your reviewer. Moving on to item M, the RIR is asking for documentation of your peak fixed route bus service requirements. So that could be a rolling stock roster as an overlay, maybe some documentation or information from your scheduling software or dispatch records. So this is for, of course, fixed route operators. You would want to put the date of this peak period reporting. I think that is important because things are changing very rapidly. And if your peak vehicle report is at any way different from the information that you've reported to NTD, obviously you would want to explain that discrepancy. Moving on to item N. So a deviation request or special dispensation for spare ratio. The basic requirement here is that if you have more than 50 vehicles, that's a large enough sample size. So FTA says your spare vehicle ratio should be about 20%. That's the standard. Now, of course, there might be a compelling reason why you differ from that standard. If that is the case, you want to make sure you provide documentation, specifically any correspondence you've had with your FTA region approving your deviation from that 20% standard. Great, continuing on, item O, the contingency fleet plan. So this is applicable only if you have a contingency fleet. So a contingency fleet typically describes vehicles that maybe have reached the end of their useful life. They're essentially on mothball status, but they can have a potential use. A good example is perhaps in an emergency. So if you do have a contingency fleet, you're going to need this contingency fleet plan, and it should justify the reason why you have the contingency fleet. You should also describe how you're storing the vehicles, and of course, any ongoing maintenance that you're using to just kind of ensure that the contingency fleet is in good shape. That would all be documented in the contingency fleet plan. Item P, this is a rail fleet management plan. I think it's pretty obvious. This only applies to recipients with rail operations, so I'll be very quick here. If you do fall into that bucket, this rail fleet management plan really has 6 required elements: operating policies, peak requirements, a maintenance or overhaul program, system and service expansions, rail car procurements, and spare vehicle justification. So these are a lot of things that we just talked about in the context of other modes of service. Moving on to item Q, again, we've seen this in a few sections now. If you have any lease agreements with private operators, you would provide that or a sample if you have several. And again, your reviewer would just make sure that that document contains certain required elements that are explained more in the contractor's manual. Excellent. So here are some more RIR tips. So as you can see, the first one, try to be as accurate as possible when you answer the questions about which assets or facilities have a federal interest. We kind of hit this at the beginning of the presentation. That really is a threshold question in many lines of questioning, especially in the maintenance area. Like I said, and we'll get to maintenance in a bit, if there's FTA interest in the facility, it should be included in a written facility maintenance plan. So just kind of being accurate from the get-go about which assets and facilities have FTA interests will help your reviewer accurately tailor the review to your organization. Another tip we have here is be as accurate as possible when you're indicating if you have sub-recipients or contractors or both. So as you can see, we've got some language here from 2 CFR 200. Sub-recipients are usually described as non-federal entities that are receiving a sub-award from a pass-through entity to carry out part of a federal program. So that's a sub-recipient. The way I would define a contractor is typically chosen or selected as the result of a competitive procurement process. So that's one easy way to kind of separate those. But sometimes we call sub-recipients contractors and vice versa. If you dive into 2 CFR 200, it actually tells you it doesn't matter what you call it. It's the characteristics of the relationship that define whether it's a sub-recipient or a contractor. So take a look at that super circular citation if you're in need of a little additional clarification there.
Yeah, and if you're not sure, then this is one of those areas where it's great to reach out to your contractor, your reviewing contractor, prior to the review, because it really does shape. They're in every single of the 23 sections, basically. Well, maybe not the last one, but most of the sections have a sub-recipient oversight component. And so if you can determine early on that you do or do not have sub-recipients, then that helps everyone in scoping the review.
Absolutely. Great, so here we are, we're on maintenance now. The RIR is asking for, first off, a written vehicle and equipment maintenance plan. And of course, if you also operate some form of ferry service, you would include your vessels in this written vehicle maintenance plan. So really a maintenance plan should do a few things, and we have it kind of listed here. It should demonstrate your goals and objectives for carrying out the maintenance program. It should also assign specifically responsibility for who is maintaining the assets. And what perhaps is one of the most important things, especially in the context of a triennial review, your written vehicle maintenance plan will have to specifically define a series of or system of periodic inspections, so preventive maintenance to be performed at certain intervals. Typically with vehicles, that's described or defined in terms of miles. That would be the interval. But I've seen sometimes with ferries, miles isn't the best measure. It would be hours of operation or service. So it's really important. I want to just highlight something here for the written vehicle plan. It'll also extend to item B here that we see. Really, when it's time for your review and the reviewer will seek to measure the on-time performance of your preventive maintenance, really the yardstick that they will use to measure your performance is what you have in your written plan. So if your written vehicle plan is like a dusty document that you take out of the drawer every 3 or maybe 4 years when you have a review, that probably won't cut it, because it actually has to be a current document that absolutely reflects your current vehicle fleet. Otherwise, you might think that you're doing 100% of your PM on time, but if that's according to a different interval that is not the one listed in your written plan, then your on-time percentage could be tanked there. So that's why it's important to make sure the written vehicle plan reflects your current fleet and the current preventive maintenance intervals that your organization is using.
We see this a lot when agencies add electric vehicles to their fleets and don't account for that in their actual vehicle fleet plan or vehicle maintenance plans.
Very good point. Right. So item B, well, item B was just kind of the similar thing, only about facilities. So obviously, if you're doing preventive maintenance on a facility, the intervals would not be defined in terms of mileage. It would be more durational with like a frequency. So you would say perhaps on a quarterly basis, you'll inspect the HVAC system, just as an example, or perhaps on an annual basis. So it's really what you define those periodic inspections and preventive maintenance are. That's the yardstick that will be used to measure your on-time performance, just like with vehicles. All right, great. Let's move on to procurement. This happens to be my favorite topic. So item A, the RIR is asking for your organization's current procurement policies and procedures. One thing we've noted just through our course of performing many of these reviews is some FTA recipients, specifically if you are a municipality, maybe a county or a city, you might have some kind of generic purchasing policy that's county or city-wide, and that's great. It might even reflect the requirements of 2 CFR 200, but in most cases, that document would not satisfy the special FTA-specific procurement requirements that your reviewer would be interested in seeing. Just off the top of my head, a few good examples are conducting the independent cost estimate. That's something FTA looks for that isn't necessarily, described in many generic purchasing policies. Also, including those FTA-required contract clauses. You probably know that's a big finding when you kind of run it back and see which were the most common findings. So if you are in one of these situations, you would provide your FTA specific procurement policy. Perhaps you have a separate document that would come into play only when you're buying things with FTA monies. Or maybe it might be something where a lot of this is contained in kind of your local government purchasing policy, but there might be an appendix to that document that deals specifically with those FTA requirements. So just make sure you're giving your reviewer the FTA specific stuff if you're in one of those cases. Continuing on to item B, you've probably heard of the term A&E procurements. That stands for architecture and engineering. So if you're procuring A&E services, FTA says you have to do that in a specific way. So it's usually called a qualifications-based procurement process. Sometimes we refer to it as a Brooks Act procurement. If you're in a state, though, you might have a substantially similar like qualifications-based procedure that is, it reads a lot like the Brooks Act, but it's specific to your state. If that was adopted before August 10th, 2005, as you can see here, you would want to provide that along with your RIR response. Moving on to item C, procurement standards of conduct. So this is like a conflict of interest section that would kind of describe individuals. There's a kind of a broad definition of employees that not just employees, but it extends to things like immediate family members of direct employees. So this standards of conduct document is actually most commonly, I think, kind of contained in your procurement policy. But if it is for any reason separate, you would obviously want to upload that in addition. Similarly, we'll look at item D, procurement protest procedures. This is often addressed in the procurement policy itself, but if it is separate, you would obviously want to provide that in addition. Great, continuing on with procurement here. Item E is very important. I'll describe why. So the RIR is going to ask for a list of FTA funded procurements since your last review. And actually, if you look at the RIR, it'll describe specific data elements that have to be in this listing. Things that I think would be pretty obvious, like the date of the procurement, the dollar amount of the procurement, the type of procurement. That could be professional services, A&E, construction, rolling stock. Also, the solicitation method would be important to know. Was it an RFP, a request for proposals, maybe an IFB, invitation for bid, or perhaps it was a non-competitive procurement like a sole source? That would be very important information that you would want to note in this listing of FTA funded procurements. Now, the reason this is so important is because you're providing this with your RIR. What's going to happen after that is your reviewer will take a look at this listing of procurements, and from that, they'll select a sample of procurements that they want to actually do a file review of. It'll be all in kind of a virtual context, but that's why that's an important bit. I'll say a little bit more about that in just a second. Just want to hit on the last few things here. So item F, the RIR is asking for a list of change orders that are executed and are over 250,000. You might notice that amount 250,000 as the federal simplified acquisition threshold, and you would be right. So really what this is seeking to do, if you have any change orders over that amount that are considered cardinal changes or aren't necessarily within the scope of the original agreement, then that typically is treated as an unjustified sole source award. So it's something we want to avoid. I think that's what that RIR request is getting at. Moving on to item G, if you've received any bid protests or just other protests related to procurements that your organization has conducted, that's something the RIR is asking for, you provide that. Moving on to item H, if you've had any capital leases awarded since your last review, you would provide those. Again, this is just an area where there are certain required elements that your reviewer would want to confirm are in place. And then finally, list of claims under procurement. What we're talking about here are just kind of legal claims, any litigation relating to procurement efforts that your organization has undertaken. And before we move on from procurement, I just want to say, you might say, well, procurement, I heard somewhere that that was actually the triennial review topic. Of all 23, procurement's just one, and it is actually the home to the highest concentration of findings. And you would be right if you heard that. But then you might say, why do we only have 2 slides about procurement? Well, this is kind of just the way the RIR is formatted. Remember, this is an initial information request. Really, the big thing here is you're providing your procurement policy and the list of procurements. I think the reason why there can potentially be a lot of findings in procurement is because we're also doing, in addition to that, so in addition to looking at your policy and how you answer the questions, there are going to be these file reviews, and your reviewer will check to make sure everything that should be part of the procurement history is present. So I think that's how procurement sometimes generates a lot of findings, even though if you look at it here, you might say there were just 2 slides. Great, I'll pass it back to you, Matt, for DBE.
Okay, thanks, Greg. Yep, so now we'll move into the civil rights portion of the RIR. For disadvantaged business enterprise, DBE, then the first requirement is that you upload your DBE program, if not uploaded as TRAMS. And one thing I'd recommend here is, so the DBE program, unlike a lot of other civil rights documents, it doesn't have to be submitted on a periodic basis. You know, your EEO programs do every 4 years, your Title VI programs do every 3 years, et cetera. The DBE program isn't like that. You only have to submit an updated version if you make significant changes. However, one thing I would caution is that prior to your review, make sure that your DBE program reflects your organization as it currently is. If the person who's listed in your DBE program as the DBLO, the DBE liaison officer, if that's not accurate, then before you get to the review, then update your DBE program, submit it to TRAMS and your RCRO, just so that everything is current. That's an easy way to avoid kind of a low-hanging fruit finding. So if it's not uploaded in TRAMS, provide that to your reviewer. Then next up, you want to provide a current organizational chart, which includes the DBLO, again, the DBE liaison officer. The organization chart should show that the DBLO has direct and independent access to the CEO. In other words, doesn't have to go through channels to talk about DBE issues. Item C here, the DBLO job description. So that would actually be the job description for whoever is holding the DBLO position. And hopefully that job description at some point talks about their DBE responsibilities, their responsibilities for implementing the DBE requirements for your organization. Item D, documentation of implementation of small business element measures. I think I mentioned earlier that in 2012, the DBE regs were amended to require that all DBE programs have a small business element to foster small business participation. And so one thing that your reviewer is going to do is, first of all, they're going to look at your program to make sure that that requirement is in there. There's a small business element. But then second of all, they're going to look to you to provide documentation that you've actually implemented the small business element as you stated that you would in your DBE program. So that's definitely an important thing to have shored up to the extent possible before your review. Item E, shortfall analysis and corrective action plan, if not required to be submitted to FTA. So what we're talking about here is you establish a DBE goal, and your DBE goal is usually not usually, it's always a 3-year goal. And if you don't happen to meet that DBE goal in any particular federal fiscal year, then you are required to create a shortfall analysis that basically says, here's what our goal was, here's how we underattained and did not meet our goal. Here's what we're going to do going forward to try and meet our goal. And so that's your shortfall analysis and corrective action plan. And you have to do that for every federal fiscal year that you don't meet your goal. Sometimes this is a little confusing for people. They'll say it's a 3-year goal. Don't you get to meet it over 3 years? No. If you have a 3% goal for 2019 and you only got 2.5% DB attainment, then you have to do a shortfall analysis for 2019. If you still have that 3% goal for 2020 and you only get 2% attainment, yes, you have to do another shortfall analysis for 2020. So make sure that you go back, you look at your semi-annual uniform reports, you figure out for sure that you have attained your goal, and to the extent that you need to, make sure that you document that you have shortfall analyses for your reviewer to look at. If you happen to be a top 50 agency per FTA funding, then those agencies actually have to submit their shortfall analyses to FTA by December 29th, following the fiscal year end of the year that they didn't meet their goal. I doubt anybody on this phone call is a top 50 agency. And so for you guys, then do the shortfall analysis, make sure that you have it. You want to retain that for either when FTA just asks for it on a whim, or when they are going through an oversight review, such as your triennial review. So make sure that you've got those stored up and ready, and provide them to your reviewer so they can take a look at them for any years that you did not meet your goal and you had to perform a shortfall analysis. Next, we have item F, which is your list of DBEs terminated or substituted on a project. So the reason that you're going to provide this list is because there are particular requirements. If you have a prime contractor that terminates or substitutes a DBE, they have to, first of all, have a good cause, and they have to do things like get prior written approval from you. And there's a slew of other requirements as well. And so if you had any situations where DBE was terminated or substituted by a prime contractor, then provide a list of those to your reviewer so they can dig in and make sure that all those appropriate requirements were followed. Okay, moving on to Title VI. And before we start Title VI, I do want to just say these requests in the RER, they're not exhaustive. And so there are definitely things that your reviewer is going to ask for that aren't particularly listed out in these in the RER itself. What I would do, just to make sure that you're really prepared, is something that we've already recommended. When you're doing the RER, also have the contractor's manual open next to you, and look at what it's saying are the required documents and what follow-up documents the reviewer is supposed to ask for. So then you get really more of a holistic look at everything that's going to be involved, and you're not caught unaware by additional requests that your reviewer is inevitably going to make. But these are the base required documents for each of these civil rights sections. So I just wanted to emphasize that. So moving on to Title VI, the first required document is the most recent Title VI program, if not uploaded to TRAMS. Obviously, this is one of those documents that does have to be submitted every 3 years. And so sometimes then we know that these are in flux, they're being revised for the next submission. And so if that's the case, let your reviewer know that there's going to be a new Title VI plan in place before the review takes place, and that you will submit it as soon as it's done. That's the best approach there, because your reviewer, they don't necessarily need to be looking at your previous, now superseded Title VI program. They want to look at your new one. So that's just a way of communicating that status to your reviewer. In item B, provide a listing of Title VI investigations, complaints, and lawsuits that have occurred since your last Title VI program submission. Obviously, your Title VI plan would include all the investigations, complaints, and lawsuits that occurred during the previous 3-year period. And so what the reviewer is looking for is those complaints and lawsuits, et cetera, that have happened since your last Title VI submission, because those wouldn't be documented anywhere else. They want to see, first of all, that you're tracking those and that you're investigating those just as you say that you do, or say that you will do in your Title VI plan. Item C is a list of language assistance training for staff. And so this goes to your language assistance plan, which is part of your Title VI plan. Provide any details on trainings that you've provided, tools and other resources that you've used to ensure that limited English proficient persons, LEP persons, people who speak English less than very well, have access to transit system information services. So another thing to note here is, so the Title VI plan, whatever is in it, that's what you're going to be held to. You want to make sure that that the Title VI plan accurately reflects your practices and that your practices conform with what your Title VI plan says you're going to do. And so this is a prime example of that, where if you say you're going to do certain things to assist LEP persons to have access to transit information and services, then you want to be able to document and substantiate that you are doing that in accordance with the Title VI plan. Next up, item D here, examples of public participation activities performed since the last comprehensive review that align with the Title VI program. So one of the requirements under Title VI is that you provide early and continuous opportunities for minority and LEP populations to be involved in transit making decisions. Again, this is something where you've got a public participation plan that's part of your Title VI plan, and whatever you say there is something that you're supposed to be doing. And so if you say that you're going to have outreach to certain radio stations and that you're going to put a newspaper ad in the local Spanish speaking newspaper, or you're going to hold certain meetings, then you really want to be able to provide evidence that you're doing all those things in the appropriate situations to your reviewer to show implementation of your Title VI plan. Next up, for item E, you want to provide a list of transit facilities that you cited or constructed since the last comprehensive review, and you'll want to provide copies of the corresponding equity analyses for those. And this is something that applies, occasionally there's a little misunderstanding about this. This applies to you whether you reach the Title VI threshold or not. So even if you're below that threshold and you have fewer than 50 vehicles in peak service and you're not in 200,000 UZA, then it's still a requirement that you do an equity analysis for new transit facilities that you cite or construct. So just keep that in mind and have those available, submit those to your reviewer. Then for F, this is more of a forward-looking obverse of the same coin, list of transit facilities that you plan on constructing in the upcoming 3 years. And either if you're far enough along in the process, then provide the copies of equity analyses that you've already done, provide those to the reviewer. Or if it's not quite there yet in the process, then use that explanation box, that comment box, and explain, we're not there yet. We've got this, in the offing, and here's where we're planning on doing it. So provide that information, give that to your reviewer. Next up is item G. We're going to want to provide a list of any fare changes or major service changes since the last Title VI program submission. Include the dates of those changes, brief description of the changes, and commensurate with that, then you are going to want to provide equity analyses or fare equity analyses, service equity analyses or fare equity analyses for each of those major service changes or fare changes. And the requirement to do the equity analysis here, this is for only the recipients who are above that Title VI threshold. So in other words, if you have more than 50 vehicles in peak service and you're in a UZA of 200,000 or more, then at that point, then you're required to conduct equity analyses for major service changes or fare changes. So provide those to your reviewer. In addition, same thing, if you have any new fixed guideway service, any new starts or small starts projects and you're above that threshold, then you should have those equity analyses to provide to your reviewer. J is only applicable to states and state DOTs, so we're just going to skip over that one. And most likely this doesn't apply, but if you happen to be an MPO direct recipient on this call, you want to provide a list of all sub-recipient applications received during the review period. So if you've got any applicants, then there are requirements, especially with their first time applicants. So your reviewer is going to want to make sure that you've got those applications and everything that's supposed to be in there is in there. So that's for that. So we've got a couple more RAR tips. Ooh, one that we haven't said enough. Use the comments from recipients column of each RAR section stable as often as possible. If you have questions about what you need to provide, contact your reviewer and ask. They'll definitely appreciate this. They'll pick up the phone call, and because anything that if you're unsure, then they can clarify it for you, and that prevents you from potentially doing additional work that wasn't really necessary because you didn't understand something. They would rather you get it to them and get the appropriate stuff to them. It makes their lives easier, it makes your life easier. And so definitely reach out to your reviewers about anything you're confused about, and they will help you. Finally, use links to your website and other websites, documents when appropriate. So if you've got reasonable modification policy on your website or something like that, you don't necessarily have to send a PDF of your reasonable modification policy. You can provide a link to your website if it's communicating the same thing. That's perfectly fine and acceptable. And with that segue, moving on to ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, and these are the general requirements as opposed to the Complementary Paratransit requirements. First thing we want to provide is your ADA complaint procedures. Again, this is something where the website citation is perfectly acceptable. One thing I'll caution you on is that it should be clear to someone visiting your website that the complaint procedures for ADA, they apply to all services, including fixed route. Oftentimes we'll go to someone's website, we'll go to an agency's website and you won't be able to find ADA complaint procedures. And then you go to their Complementary Paratransit page. And it's great that it's somewhere, but at the same time, it really should be its own thing, because there are ADA complaints that can arise from fixed route. There are ADA complaints that can arise from Complementary Paratransit. There are ADA complaints that can arise from someone being in one of your facilities. So it's definitely, the ADA complaint procedures are not limited to Complementary Paratransit. They should be broader than that, and they should be advertised so the public will find them, even if they're not a Complementary Paratransit user. Next up is the ADA complaint form. One of the requirements under ADA is that you sufficiently advertise to the public the means by which they make a complaint if they feel aggrieved under the ADA. Again, a website citation is acceptable. Definitely, again, same thing. You want to make sure that it's the ADA complaint form, it's clear that it's talking about ADA or disability. Sometimes you see joint ADA or joint complaint forms that are talking about, customer service complaints, Title VI complaints, ADA complaints. It's okay to use a joint complaint form, but you have to make sure that's clearly differentiated. So you want to have, a checkbox for ADA/disability discrimination, checkbox for discrimination on the basis of race, color, national origin, a checkbox on just customer service, whatever. You need to make that very clearly differentiated. So that's something to keep in mind. So for your reviewer, again, provide complaint procedures and the complaint form to them so they can take a look at that. The next item in ADA general is the ADA complaint record retention procedures. So ADA complaints have to be retained for at least a year, and a log of those complaints has to be retained for at least 5 years. So provide your ADA complaint record retention procedures to your reviewer so they can confirm that you're doing that. They'll obviously confirm it during their review as well. Item D, provide driver handbooks, operating and training materials, ADA related service bulletins, anything that you're doing to train your staff. If you've got PowerPoints, anything like that, provide those. For item E, so you should have some type of a process for monitoring your employees to ensure that they are complying with provision of service requirements. So using the lift correctly, stop announcements, they're not passing by people in wheelchairs, they're handling service animals correctly. You want to make sure that your employees are doing that. And so what E is asking for is sample monitoring materials such as surveys, checklists, interview forms. Sometimes in certain agencies will even use like camera footage if the vehicles are equipped with cameras, just to monitor and make sure that their drivers and operators are complying with ADA provision of service requirements. So provide anything that you can with that respect. Item F, ADA reasonable modifications procedures. So this is something that should be advertised to the public, that you on request will make a reasonable modification to your policies and procedures, a couple of exceptions, but you nonetheless have to advertise this. So just a link to the website saying that the agency on request will make reasonable modifications to its procedures should satisfy this. So provide that to your reviewer. And your reviewer will undoubtedly also be doing an independent review of your website for a lot of these things. So provide to your reviewer, but they'll also be checking as well. Item G, rider's guides, including paratransit guides. The reason we say including paratransit guides, even though this is ADA general, is sometimes there are descriptions of ADA requirements, ADA aspects in the paratransit guides that are just applicable across the board. So maybe the paratransit guide is where they describe their policy on service animals. So provide anything that's rider guides, including paratransit guides, to your reviewers so that they can look at that. Item H is a list of new facilities constructed or facilities altered since the last review. Your reviewer is going to want to make sure that there are any newly constructed or altered facilities that they were made accessible to the maximum extent possible. Item I, so if you're a demand response operator and you've acquired inaccessible vehicles since the last review, then you have a couple obligations. The first thing is that you need to have done a equivalent service analysis showing that people with disabilities and people without disabilities are being treated equivalently. And so you'd want to have that analysis handy, but then also the year that you acquired those inaccessible vehicles, then you were supposed to submit a certification of equivalent service to FTA. And so both of those things are follow-ups that your reviewer is going to want to confirm. So provide those to your reviewer. Moving on to ADA Complementary Paratransit. So obviously, if you operate fixed route service, then you are required, with a few minor exceptions, to provide complementary paratransit to your service area as well. And so in this section, the first requirement is that you provide to the reviewer your paratransit rider's guide. You also want to provide the paratransit application form. You want to provide operations, dispatch, scheduling, or reservation procedures so that your reviewer can look through those and see, okay, at least they've got written down in their procedure that someone calls up to make a reservation, then we're scheduling that within an hour on either side of that reservation request. That type of thing they could figure out by reading those. Okay, this is at least the written procedure. They'll verify it that's implemented in practice during the course of the review, but it'll give the reviewer an idea of what your procedures are in writing. Item D, sample notification letters, templates for conditional eligibility, temporary eligibility, and denials. A couple of things here. The first of which is the reviewer is going to want to make sure that those letters state with specificity why the recipient was not given unconditional eligibility. So that's one thing that they're going to look for. And then another, and they may request actual letters that have been sent out to just verify that that has been the case in practice. The other thing that they're going to look for is, are you advising in these letters that the recipient and the person who applied for eligibility, are you advising them that they have an opportunity, a right to appeal not getting full unconditional eligibility? So anytime you provide anything less than full unconditional eligibility, then you need to give the applicant the right to appeal if they're dissatisfied with that decision. So have that in those letters so your reviewer can see that you're doing that. Next is item E. So submit your definitions for capacity constraints, meaning denials, missed trips, whatever your definition is for on-time performance, how you calculate excessively long trips. And importantly, you want to, along with those definitions, actually submit data showing that you're monitoring your service, you're monitoring your denials, your missed trips, your excessively long trips, your on-time performance, et cetera. So, and then if you are identifying a capacity constraint, then you are taking action to mitigate that. So you want to have the definitions submitted to the reviewer as well as the data. And if there is any type of finding that there is a capacity constraint, what you're doing about it. Next up, item F, we have ADA Complementary Paratransit Service Contracts. And again, this is something, so the reviewer is going to want to look at your complementary paratransit service contracts if you're outsourcing that service. Similarly, it's not mentioned in general, but in the general ADA section, but your reviewer is also going to want to see any type of service contracts that aren't related to complementary paratransit. So if you're you have first mile, last mile, or you have microtransit, or you have contracts with TNCs, anything along those lines, they're going to want to see those contracts or agreements as well. So just keep that in mind. And under G, then we have oversight tools for service provided under contract or other arrangement or relationship. And so this is, again, first of all, when we think of contractor arrangement, think very broadly. It includes award, sub-award, cooperative agreement, all sorts of things. And you want to provide any oversight tools that you have, any reports showing that you've conducted oversight, questionnaires that you're using, checklists that you're using to ensure ADA complementary paratransit service requirements are being met. For H, then this is actually asking for copies of the actual contracts, so not just the oversight documents, but the contracts or arrangements or agreements, whatever they happen to be, that you provide copies of those to your reviewer as well. And I is oversight tools for sub-recipients, including required reports, questionnaires, and checklists for ADA complementary paratransit service. So if you've got a sub-recipient, they're outsourcing complementary paratransit service, you want to be able to submit to your reviewer evidence of your sub-recipient's oversight and in turn, your oversight of your sub-recipient. So moving on, next up, we've got equal employment opportunity, EEO. The first thing that your reviewer is going to be looking for is the number of recipient employees working for the FTA funded program. And a couple things to keep in mind here. We're including both full-time employees, part-time employees, anyone, any transit related employees. And the reason that this is important is because if you have a certain number of transit related employees and you request or receive at least $1 million a year, then you are required to have either an abbreviated or full EEO program. If you have 50 or more transit related employees and you request or receive $1 million or more, then you have to have an abbreviated program. If you have 100 or more transit related employees and that $1 million, you have to have a full program. So let your reviewer know what your current headcount is, both again for full and part-time employees. Then if you do meet the threshold, then you are going to want to submit your EEO program unless it's otherwise in trams already. And so EEO programs are something that get submitted every 4 years and they're due by March 1st. So it's possible that between when you submit your RIR and when you have your review, then you would have submitted a new EEO program. So if that's going to be the case, again, let your reviewer know that and give them the revised or the new iteration of the EEO program around March 1st once it's completed and submitted to FTA. Item C, sample documents used for internal and external dissemination of EEO program. So we're talking things like employee handbooks, onboarding materials, maybe posters that you have in the break room alerting employees. Those are all examples of internal dissemination. Examples of external dissemination are, maybe you have a job posting and you're alerting the job applicants that you are an equal employment opportunity employer. Maybe you have communications with job fairs or educational institutions, stuff like that, where there are external communications, and you want to make sure that those are provided to your reviewer as well, so they can see both your internal and your external dissemination. For item D, then the organizational chart identifying the EEO officer. Definitely provide that. You want to show that the EEO officer is, first of all, an executive and typically has a direct reporting relationship to your CEO. For item E, designated employee and EEO officer job descriptions. That's important because, again, first of all, your EEO officer, you're going to want to check that in their job descriptions, it explains their EEO responsibilities. It says that they're going to be involved and concur in the hiring and promotional process, and they're going to meet with the CEO at least semi-annually, those types of things. So get the EEO officer's job description, make sure that there are EEO aspects in there. And same thing for designated employees who are clearly in a supporting role to help implement the EEO program at your agency, provide those as well. Item F, provide your standard performance evaluation for managers and supervisors. Item G, include for your reviewer your employment practices chart. If you want to know what goes into that, we've got a circular reference here for you. Provide your EEO complaint logs. And when you provide your EEO complaint logs, I would suggest that you include everything. You read complaint very broadly. So those would be EO complaints that were made to the EO officer, that were made to HR, that were filed with an external institution like the EOC, or, you know, if there's lawsuits, if there is pending litigation, all those things should be included with the complaint log. You can redact, you should redact employee names for privacy considerations, that type of thing. The reviewer doesn't need to know that. For item I, agendas and sign-in sheets for meetings conducted when the EO policy and its implementation are explained. Anything, again, showing that you're doing that internal dissemination or potentially external dissemination. J, agendas and sign-in sheets for EO training or meetings with management. Again, your EO officer, they're supposed to have at least semi-annual meetings with the CEO. So having documentation of that, whether that's minutes or sign-in sheets, agendas, whatever it happens to be. Item K, lists of EO training topics that you've trained staff on. Item L, list of newly hired supervisors and managers who attended the EO supervisory training. Sample of recruitment entities and ads for job positions, so that again, the reviewer could see that you're including, you know, this is an EO equal opportunity employer on job applications or job postings and whatnot. For N, a log of recruitment locations and recruitment dates for the review period. So if you have job fairs, or again, you're holding, you know, you go to a educational institution or a local business group or something like that, and you're advertising about EO, informing the public about EO, and you're recruiting new employees, then definitely document all those types of things. For O, list of internal and external dissemination of the EO program for each year since the last EO plan update. Again, obviously the EO plans every 4 years get submitted. So you'd want to have items explaining the internal and external dissemination that you've done since the last submission. For P, list of meetings with affinity groups since the last EO plan update. And Q, if you have sub-recipients, then provide a list of those and preferably the number of employees that they have. That way the reviewer can say, okay, you have contractors or sub-recipients that have 50 or more employees, request to receive $1 million or more, et cetera. And they can figure out that, okay, TransDev or whoever it happens to be may be required to have a abbreviated program, and you're collecting that and making sure that they're compliant and making sure that they're implementing their DB or their EO program, excuse me. So a couple more RIR tips. Make sure your documents are dated. I find this one really important just because it's good for version control. If I'm looking at 2 Title VI plans and one's dated 10 days ahead of the other one, then I'm going to look at the current one. I know that I'm not wasting my time looking at a superseded Title VI plan. If a requested document is in the process of being revised, indicate that in the RIR comments. If after the RIR submission, you have updated documents or new documents, submit them to your reviewer. One thing I would caution you is your reviewer's FTP site may not notify your reviewer that new documents have been added or anything like that. And so if after the RIR submission deadline comes around, if you're going to be submitting new documents or revised documents, I would just either call up or email your reviewer and say, what's the best way to get these to you? Do you want me to upload them to your FTP site? And they'll say, okay, I know it's coming. I'll go check that FTP site, or alternatively, just email them to me. And so check with the reviewer how they want to approach that, just to make sure that they're aware that there are new, revised, or additional documents that have been added or submitted. Okay, on to school bus, Greg.
Great. So I'll take it here. Thanks, Matt, and great work so far. School bus. So the general rule here is FTA does not want its recipients using federal monies to operate school bus service, potentially in competition with private school bus operators. So in general, I think many of the recipients on this call do not engage in exclusive school bus service. However, it is possible, perhaps you've received special permission from FTA, or maybe you're operating school bus service as an organization using completely local funding. So it's very likely that this would be NA, but we'll run through it very quickly. So if you do operate exclusive school bus operations, either you have special permission or one of those exemptions, RAR is asking for item A here. You would want to list the recipients, the sub-recipients, the contractors, and the lessees, and their assets that are used in exclusive school bus operation. Just kind of in the interest of time, we'll move to the last item, C here. Of course, your RAR would ask for any complaints received relating to school bus service. So with that, we'll move on to charter bus. Great. And similar here, the rule is that FTA does not want its recipients using federal money potentially in competition with private charter bus operators. But of course, like any good rule, there are exceptions and exemptions. So check out the contractor's manual. It does a really good way of visually kind of presenting what the exceptions are and what the exemptions are. So if you are operating charter service under one of the exceptions that's identified in the contractor's manual, then the RAR is asking for you to provide a charter service log with a clear statement that specifically identifies which charter service exception you're relying on when you provided the charter service. As we continue on, we can see that the RAR is asking for a list of any real property, including facilities, also equipment, meaning rolling stock, that you used for charter bus operations. And of course, you would want to list any sub-recipients, contractors, or lessees that operate charter service. And then finally, similar to school bus, the RAR is asking for a list of any complaints received related to the charter bus service. Great. So we're going to talk about DFWA now, Drug-Free Workplace Act. So there are actually two separate chapters on the drug and alcohol topics. This is the first one. Then we're going to move into the drug and alcohol testing program. So you can see the RAR is asking for item A here, your written drug-free workplace policy. Now your DFWA policy is probably different from your drug and alcohol testing policy. I don't want to confuse you, but I will say sometimes I do see the DFWA content inside the drug and alcohol testing policy. So you may have it kind of covered as one document. It may also be two separate documents. In item B, the RAR is asking for examples of drug-free awareness notifications. This commonly takes the form of EAPs or employee assistance programs. So the RAR is asking you to upload brochures, perhaps posters, any information you have on bulletin boards about your EAP, if that's the route you go, or if you have some other material or way to demonstrate that you're disseminating information or resources regarding drug-free awareness. And I do want to specifically say here, we've received very clear guidance from FTA that your reviewer should never actually ask you for pictures of the inside of your facility, I think for privacy and potentially cybersecurity reasons. So when we say posters, brochures, I wouldn't snap a picture of that and then send it along with your RAR submission. As we move on to item C, the RAR is asking for the number of employees with a federal or state criminal drug statute conviction that occurred in the workplace within our review period. So it's asking for the number. Hopefully that number is 0. If it's not 0, you would want to report that. And of course, that's not game over. It would just open up an additional line of inquiry. Your reviewer would seek to confirm that the proper notices were made within the required time frame. So let's move on to the next chapter then, the drug and alcohol testing program. So the RAR is asking for a copy of your board-adopted drug and alcohol testing policy. Now, you might say, we don't have a board of directors at my organization. So if it's not a board of directors, it'll be whatever the equivalent final authority is for your organization. And as you can see, the drug and alcohol testing program, it applies to all recipients of sections 5307, 5309, 5311, and 5339 funds that have safety-sensitive employees. So let's contrast that with DFWA, which we just discussed. The Drug-Free Workplace Act actually applies to any federal program, whether that employee is safety sensitive or not. But of course, the drug and alcohol testing program zeroes in on only those safety sensitive employees. Item B, the RAR is asking you to provide a list of covered employees that are in those safety sensitive positions. And also that list of employees should identify any supervisors or other officials within your organization that are charged with making reasonable suspicion determinations. I'll talk right now actually a little bit more about reasonable suspicion in the context of item C here. The RIR is asking for your training material, training programs for covered employees and supervisors. As you may know, every safety sensitive employee is required to get some training on an annual basis about the dangers of prohibited drug use in the workplace, but separate and in addition to that, any supervisors that are tasked with making that reasonable suspicion determination need to also have training regarding how to do that. So you would want to present evidence with your RIR submission that you're actually doing this. And item D here, the RIR is asking for certificates of your service agents. What we mean here are MROs, medical review officers, BAT, breath alcohol technicians, collectors. The contractors manual actually does a very nice job of, in a tabular format, describing when these certifications, what time period they're good for. It depends. It's either 3 or 5 years, depending on the type of position. But what you would want to submit with your RIR are the actual certificates that note the expiration date, again, for your BATs, your MROs, collectors, and anyone else. Great. And we're still on drug and alcohol program. Under item E, the RIR, of course, is asking for a list of any sub-recipients, contractors, subcontractors, and lessees that have safety-sensitive employees. This is just kind of another variation of that theme we described earlier. If you do have sub-recipients, you essentially stand in their shoes in terms of their compliance. So you do have a responsibility to exercise oversight there, and that is kind of lumped into your triennial review. Great, and I'll toss it right back to you, Matt, for the programmatic areas.
All right, great. Yeah, let's take a quick look at these. Section 5307 program requirements. The first thing that the RIR requests is a signed metropolitan transportation planning agreement between the recipient, MPO, states, and public providers of public transportation, basically delineating responsibilities, who's doing what. The second requirement under B is MPO public participation plan and tips and tip notices published since the last review. These are if the recipient is relying on the MPO's tip public participation process. If they're not, then we'd go to C, the program of projects, public notices, coordination processes, list of complaints, final and amended POPs. These are for recipients that are relying on their own Section 5307 public involvement processes. Then in addition, item D, submit to your reviewer your written policy for soliciting public comment prior to implementing a fare increase or major service reduction. Note this is a little bit different than Title VI, which is a fare change or major service change. This is just fare increase or major service reduction. So a little bit of a difference there, but provide that written policy to your reviewer. For item E, provide your application for half fare special identification card for people who are disabled or elderly or that type of thing. Item F, provide a list of fare increases and major service reductions implemented since the last review with the date that they were implemented. A couple more RIR tips. Make sure your documents are readable. Try and avoid proprietary formats for technology that your reviewer may or may not have. Do use standard Office formats like .doc, XLS, PDF, etc. And try and make sure that any documents that you do submit aren't locked or protected or anything like that. So that way the reviewer can properly navigate them. For Section 5310, there are only a couple requirements for the RIR. The first is a state correspondence approving a public body to coordinate services for seniors and persons with disabilities if applicable. B, certification documentation that no nonprofits are readily available. And C is a sample Section 5310 vehicle lease. And we're going to go ahead and skip 5311 because, again, that's something that is largely just applicable to states. Greg?
Excellent. Yeah, I can talk about this. So this is one of those brand new review areas that Matt mentioned during kind of the opening slides of this presentation. We're talking about PTASP, the Public Transportation Agency Safety Plan. So the RIR is, of course, asking for your agency safety plan. Similar actually to the drug and alcohol testing program, you want to provide documentation with your RIR submission that your board of director or whatever the equivalent final authority is that they have approved your ASP. You can see here we have an item for rail transit agencies only. You just want documentation that your safety plan has been approved by your state safety oversight agency, SSOA. Continuing on to item D, the RIR is asking for an organizational chart or other documentation that shows your safety executive's uninterrupted line of reporting to the accountable executive. Of course, we're asking for this separately if it's not already included in the ASP. Great, so continuing on in item E, the RIR is asking for an emergency preparedness and response plan, again, if not already included in the ASP. That's for rail transit agencies only. And then F and G, these final two items are for states only. So I think just in the interest of time, we can keep on going. Great, and this is the last and final topic, a brand new one, cybersecurity. Now, right now, this is only applicable to recipients that operate rail service. And believe it or not, there are no requested documents, at least at the RIR phase. So I do expect actually this chapter to probably be built out in subsequent and future review cycles. As we probably all have a sense of, cybersecurity is becoming very important. So it's another topic that perhaps future iterations of the Triennial and State Management Review will look at in more detail. Again, for now, it's just applicable to recipients operating rail service. And at the RIR stage of the review, there are no documents that are being requested of you.
Okay, so we have our final poll question here. If you guys wouldn't mind, the poll question is, did you find this webinar useful? And your options are definitely yes, mostly yes, neutral, mostly no, definitely no. And let's get this pulled up here. No pun intended.
And as we're pulling that up, I also want to say that what we're planning on doing is sending to everyone who participated in this webinar. We'll just send out to the distribution list a SurveyMonkey link that will be your opportunity to provide more detailed feedback. As you saw, we're doing this presentation a number of times, so we definitely want your perspective on how we can make it even better.
Okay. So with that, and the polling. So now we'll open it up to questions. I know that it looks like the chat and the Q&A have a number of questions in there. We know that we are a few minutes over at this time, but we, again, can stay on, answer a few questions right now. And then again, we're going to have that office hours tomorrow from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. Eastern time. And that'll just be us sitting here answering any questions that you can have. We'll give any guidance that we can. Obviously, some things we'll have to defer and recommend that you actually talk to your particular reviewer about. But to the extent that we can, then we'll definitely give you our insight.
Absolutely. We'd love to see you there.
So one of the first questions that came up actually several times, when folks are completing their vehicle fleet listing, they want to know as of what date. Is that as of the RIR or is it at some other date? And so can you address that? And then a related question is, can you elaborate on what is going to happen as far as the spare ratio in light of the pandemic?
Yeah, so I mean, I first of all, I think that the answer to the first question is it's the status of your fleet inventory when you submit the RER. So whatever that happens to be on January 21st or whatever your submission date is, then that would be the accurate number. I would have to probably defer to FTA as far as how spare ratio might be affected by the pandemic. I will say that last year, then there was the public health supplement, which was issued by FTA after the original RER. And basically what that did is it had a couple of questions in each or in a number of subjects that was asking for feedback and whatnot from recipients as far as how they'd adapted to COVID, but it also provided allowances and flexibilities for a number of things where you wouldn't have to turn in something at the normal time. You'd get an extra couple months or so on. So I also can say that, FTA, they're aware there is a pandemic and they're practical people. And so I can't speak for them, but I would imagine that there would be some flexibility. And ultimately, your reviewer is not actually making any findings. What they're doing is they're the conduit, they're the eyes and ears, and they take the information that they see, they feed it back to FTA. So your program manager, your RCRO, regional civil rights officer, all those types of things. And so it's not just your reviewer making a decision, they're doing that in concert with FTA staff. And so I can't give you any firm answer, but I would imagine that there would be some consideration there.
Well said, Matt. Nothing to add here.
I also, there have been a number of folks that have been very concerned, have not been able to either download the presentation or for some reason have not been able to access it, as well as the contractor's manual, as well as the invitation to the office hours. So I just would like to remind everybody that those were actually, all of those were in the chat box. So again, I'm going to repeat: the contractor's manual, this presentation, as well as the invitation to office hours were all listed in the chat box. If by chance you still are not able to see those, I'm going to once again list our email address. And so please feel free to email us and we will then send that information to you directly to your email address. So I'm going to be posting that in the chat box here in a second. But while I'm doing that, another question was, how will confidential information be shared?
Before we get to that question, Robbie, is the Survey Monkey that we're sending out to everyone, is that going to happen pretty shortly? Because we could probably, I don't know if it's possible, we could send out the Survey Monkey survey to all the registrants for this webinar, and we could include as attachments the items that people are having difficulty with.
They'll probably be separate because we've already been sending out to a number of folks.
Okay.
But just stay tuned.
Okay.
Stay tuned.
And so getting to the question on confidentiality, I think it depends. For certain things, then definitely feel free to redact. Yep. Like we were saying in for equal opportunity complaints and whatnot, your reviewer doesn't need to know the person's name or details like that. To a certain extent, there are going to be areas where we're going to ask you when you submit that list of federally funded procurements to us, and we select 9 of them and ask you to provide those documents, then we're going to be asking you to provide documents that may have some sensitive information. It may have feigns and whatnot. And for those, I would just say that it's probably something that you just probably have to do. And I can say that your reviewer, they're not interested in the confidential information. They're just merely doing this on behalf of FTA, and so you can be assured that whatever you upload is only going to be looked at in a professional from a professional standpoint.
Absolutely. The only thing I would add to that is keep the line of communication open with your lead reviewer. If you do have concerns about sharing specific documents and
Right.
redacting those documents is not an option, there are other things you can do. Maybe instead of submitting the documents, we've actually worked in situations where it was a temporary screen share or something like that. So there are other ways the reviewers can kind of confirm the information and documentation they'd like to see. So please work with your reviewer. Because this is now a virtual format, it'll probably feel more like a partnership than past review cycles. So just keep that dialogue going.
Yeah, everybody is being flexible necessarily.
There seems to be some confusion about the 3 years versus 4 years cycle here. There have been a number of individuals that are on this webinar that had their last review in 2019. Mm-hmm. And so they were anticipating their review this year, but they have not received notice. So can you please address when those individuals should expect their review?
Well, I'll let you go.
Greg.
Sorry, Matt.
COVID seems to be that we just lost a year. And so For the people who received notices, if you're getting reviewed next year, I would highly anticipate that you've received notice about it by now. I believe the deadline for sending those out was November 29th, so that was a couple weeks ago. So if you haven't received a notice, I would check, maybe inquire with your regional office, just double check and be like, we're not up for a review this year, are we? We need to know. So I would say that. As for the reviewers who they know that they're getting reviewed this year, then the period of the review is basically from the day after their exit conference, their previous exit conference. So if they had a review and it ended on June 5th, 2018, then count the review cycles starting from June 6th through the present.
Okay. I believe this was regarding the financial section. There was a discussion about that individuals are going to be asked to provide resumes of the individuals who are performing some of their primary functions. And so the question was what are they looking for in those resumes? You know, what types of credentials might be expected?
Yeah, so there are no, sorry, just wanted to let you finish. There are no specific credentials. Remember, we're just comparing those resumes to your generic job descriptions of those positions. So your reviewer will just seek to confirm that those people who do have those key financial related jobs match up with what the qualifications as defined by your organization are for those positions.
Yeah, they're just looking for, do the people who are handling financial duties, do they have the appropriate capacity to do so? And there isn't necessarily one thing or another that gives someone the capacity to be able to be responsible for financial duties. But, you know, it could be education, it could be experience, it could be you have to be a CPA, it could be a variety of things, but it's just something that is going to be examined.
Okay, and do you list your, do they list their sub-recipients procurements on their DBE listing?
So their sub-recipient procurements, their contracting opportunities should theoretically have been reported on the recipients' uniform reports that they submit semi-annually. And so for the most part, I think I defer to your reviewer, but I should think that they would not be looking at those.
And then when you're asking for the list of protests, are those protests just solely on FTA procurements, or are those on all procurements?
Yeah, the focus here will be on FTA funded procurements.
Okay. And then when they're listing procurements, are they to list their micro purchases on their list of procurements, or which ones are they supposed to be listing on their RIR response?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So if you do have an overall listing of all your FTA funded procurements, I believe that is the language that the RIR is asking for. However, I can tell you that from that list, your reviewer will almost certainly sample just procurements above the simplified acquisition threshold when they're doing their file review, because really that's when FTA officially says, okay, you need an independent cost estimate, or you need a cost and price analysis. Now, there might be, you know, other kind of exotic situations, like maybe a sole source procurement or a single bid procurement. If that does appear on the listing, your reviewer might be interested in seeing that. So I would be over-inclusive in terms of the listing of your FTA funded procurements, but recognize that the ones that will likely be selected for the file review will be above the simplified acquisition threshold, which is currently set at the federal level at $250,000.
What would happen, Greg, if the recipient has a self-imposed lower threshold upon which they would consider it a formal procurement?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is, if you intentionally set a lower or more restrictive threshold than that at the federal level, then that's what we're going to go with. So it could be that for your organization, the simplified acquisition threshold is perhaps $150,000 or maybe even $100,000. We've seen really the whole range there. So go with what your local, perhaps it's lower or more restrictive than the federal threshold, but go with the local.
Are group TAM plan sponsors to send the group TAM plan on behalf of the recipients, or does the recipient need to get a copy of that group TAM plan to submit as in response to the RIR?
Great question. And I think the answer is the group TAM plan participant should have a copy of the finalized TAM plan that they're participating in. If you recall back to some of those documents, that was actually a specific thing that the RIR is asking for. So if you're a group TAM plan participant, you should, if you kind of followed the regulation, already have a copy of that. If somehow you don't, you want to get that and you make sure you're uploading it with your RIR.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is an EEO question. So when the EEO list of full and part-time employees, does that include all employees from service workers all the way to the director and everybody in between?
It's transit related employees. So anybody who is assisting an FTA funded transit function.
Okay. So if you have a if you purchase transportation, it's a turnkey operation. Do you want the contractors or the entities, the service providers, EEO, or do you want the cities, the recipients?
So you actually, so you definitely want the recipients. And then if the contractor, if they meet the threshold for needing to have an EEO program, so if they meet that 50 transit-related employees, that requires that they have an abbreviated EEO program, then not only what we want to see is at that point, it's really an oversight question. So we want to see that the city is collecting that EEO program from the contractor, evaluating it for sufficiency, and then conducting some type of oversight to make sure that the contractor is complying with EEO requirements. So theoretically, that recipient should already have collected the contractor's EEO program and should have some type of oversight mechanisms there.
Okay. In kind of like the respecting everybody's time here, again, I'm going to once again basically put the an email address. So if by chance you're still having difficulty downloading information, I'm going to put it once again in the chat box. So please feel free to ask us or send us an email, and we'll send you that information, including the invitation for the office hours tomorrow. But I also want to make sure that everybody knows that they're invited to do that. They're also invited to participate in the latter sessions as well. And so I think perhaps there's also lots of questions about how people can get copies of the recording. We'll also put that in an email as well. So just be checking your emails. We're going to be answering some of those questions. We'll be and addressing those in office hours tomorrow. But there's just one last question that I think maybe we can conclude on, and that is, how is COVID-19 going to come into play with these reviews?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think Matt kind of alluded to part of the answer just a couple minutes ago when he said that previously in our FY21 reviews, FTA issued a supplement to the contractors manual that dealt specifically with the COVID pandemic. Now, there is no supplement this year, but what's happened is the relevant information in that supplement has now been incorporated into the contractor's manual. That's why it grew in length by about 100 pages. It's now 650 pages. So as you review the contractor's manual, you'll see numerous places throughout where the pandemic is referenced. And as Matt mentioned a few minutes ago, there are certain areas where FTA has granted administrative relief regarding some deadlines and things like that. So the good news is all of that info is in one place, and that place is the FY22 contractor's manual.
Okay, I think with that, we're probably ready to conclude the session. And we'll be ready for office hours tomorrow. Again, I'm putting in our email address one more time in the chat box, so please check that out.
Great. Well, I have to say, this is the second year basically that FTA has decided to do these RIR presentations. And so we hope that you found it valuable. Hopefully this was useful for you. And we definitely was a great attendance. So we appreciate everyone who took the time to be here today, and hopefully it makes your lives a little bit easier when you're preparing your response to the RAR. And I hope also that the reviewers find it helpful on the flip side. So thank you everyone for your attendance.
Thanks all and good luck. You're going to do well. Don't worry.
Yeah.
That's no guarantee of an outcome. I just want to you view this process positively.
All right.